Drug wars. They've been declared on local, regional, and national levels.
We seized their heroin.
69 tons of marijuana.
We are not going to allow the cartels to take over the United States.
I have authorization to fire into your vessel.
In 2011, a group of world leaders, including 7 ex-presidents, set up the Global Commission on Drug Policy to end the 40-year war on drugs. But wars are easier to start than they are to finish. It's June 1971, and President Richard Milhous Nixon is in a fighting mood.
We must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number 1 in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
That was a time where you had both rising levels of sort of crime, and there was more sort of agitation around civil rights and all of this. You also had the hippies, and you had marijuana, you had the counterculture. And Richard Nixon saw himself as speaking for the silent majority, the silent middle class.
The answer for a country already fighting one war in Vietnam? Another one, on drugs, to combat the number of Americans using illegal narcotics.
What really tipped Nixon over was starting in 1970. There became a tremendous amount of intravenous heroin use in Vietnam, and that really kicked him over.
I shall soon propose a revision of the entire federal criminal code, which will give us tougher penalties against drugs and against crime.
But the war on drugs would not be confined to the United States. In order to stem the production and supply of illegal narcotics, America has sought, even insisted upon, help from the rest of the world.
The American government convinced the United Nations and the other governments that the main goal for United Nations would be in the area of drugs to zero drugs, to avoid any kind of drug. And secondly, that the instrument to get this goal was repression, war on drugs.
The UN conventions on drugs amounted to a global ban on producing, transporting, selling, and possessing any drug classified as illegal. And it set in stone an attitude to narcotics that has lasted for decades.
So in the crusade for a drug-free America, the next step is to enforce a policy of zero tolerance of illegal drug use. So when we say no to drugs, it'll be clear that we mean absolutely none.
Yet, in spite of the massive and sustained efforts of law enforcement, demand for illegal drugs has continued to rise.
Do not wish to do so.
Heroin use spiked in the early 70s. Then there was cocaine.
The government was completely unprepared for the explosive growth of the drug problems. I think we totally misunderstood cocaine.
Originalmente Colombia era el país donde se procesaba, pero la producción estaba en Bolivia y en Perú. Después también se empezó a cultivar en Colombia y los carteles de la droga se fueron volviendo muy poderosos.
America's insatiable appetite for cocaine made criminals like Pablo Escobar the richest and most powerful of all time. Escobar's cartel was smuggling 15 tons of cocaine a day into the U.S., and in 1989, Forbes magazine declared him the 7th richest man in the world, worth an estimated $25 billion. Cesar Gaviria was president of Colombia during the state's fight against Escobar.
Escobar tenía una red clandestina muy grande, era impresionantemente poderoso, la gente le tenía mucho temor. Más que corrupción, la gente le tenía intimidada a toda la sociedad.
Escobar's policy of dealing with law enforcement was plata o plomo, a bribe or a bullet. And when the U.S. and Colombian governments finally took him on, the ensuing struggle made Colombia the murder capital of the world, with over 52,000 violent deaths in 2 years. And even the president wasn't immune.
Una de estas organizaciones alimentada por el narcotráfico tuvo a mi hermano secuestrado bajo tierra sin poderse mover durante 3 meses sin cambiarse la ropa. Salió completamente traumatizado, paralizado. Fue una cosa muy traumática. Hace un par de años las FARC, que son hoy el principal cartel de droga de Colombia, mató a mi hermana tratando de secuestrarla para convertirla en un rehén y en una persona con la que pudieran hacer una negociación política. Y esto ocurre en todas las familias colombianas. O sea, todos han sido víctimas o de la guerrilla o del narcotráfico, y esa guerrilla está cada vez alimentada por droga.
Escobar was finally gunned down by police in December of 1993. But America and Colombia's drug problems were to continue long after the downfall of El Patron.
The death of Pablo Escobar and the working in the United States with Colombia to get him out and killed was a kind of boost to those efforts. But I don't think anyone in the supply reduction area ever felt that was going to end the problem.
Demand continued after Escobar's death, and so did supply. The next stage of the war on drugs was another large-scale attempt to wipe out the drugs at source. President Bill Clinton's Plan Colombia.
What I tried to do was to focus on every aspect of the problem. I tried to empower the Colombians, for example, to do more militarily and police-wise because I thought that they had to. 30% of their country was in the hands of the narco-traffickers.
The U.S. spent billions of dollars funding military operations in Colombia to cut off the flow of cocaine into America by eradicating Colombia's coca plantations.
Colombia es el único país del mundo que fumiga aéreamente los cultivos de droga. Es un tipo de fumigación que destruye mucho todos los cultivos aledaños.
It's a war against people who try just to earn their living growing some plant. They would like to grow something else if they would receive the same money. So I mean, you cannot make a war against drugs without knowing that doing so, you are making a war against people.
Cuando el Plan Colombia empezó, había 8 departamentos donde había sembrados de coca. Hoy hay 24 o 28, alguna cosa así.
Well, obviously, if the expected results was that we would eliminate serious drug use in America and eliminate the narco-trafficking networks, it hasn't worked.
Today, the illegal drugs trade amounts to $320 billion a year. And without laws or governments to regulate this underground market, guns and violence have inevitably become the most effective method of control.
Eu sei o quanto é perigoso ir de helicóptero a algumas favelas. Você vai desviando, porque se acharem que é polícia, os traficantes atiram.
As president of Brazil, Fernando Cardoso followed the prevailing thinking of his time and was a supporter of the war on drugs. On his watch, a new national anti-drug agency was established. Now, 8 years later, as chair of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, Cardoso is back to see for himself what the fight against narcotics has done to favelas like these.
Let me tell you very frankly, when I went to visit some of the favelas in a very violent part of Rio, I was a little bit afraid. I had no security, because a precondition of being accepted into these neighborhoods is to go without guns. They have the guns, not me.
Há 60 anos era 22, 32.
Arma.
É. Aí veio, há 40 anos já começou 8, pistola, 12 de cano cerrado. Aí depois veio fuzil, metralhadora, HK, AK-47 e assim vem...
Ou seja, para você faz uma ligação direta entre o tipo de arma, a entrada da arma e a mudança do tráfico.
É isso aí.
Dizer,
Cada vez que mudava de um tipo de arma para o outro, era outro traficante, era outra pessoa, era outros...
Isso
era
aumentava também a capacidade de venda e tal ou não?
Aumentava mais a criminalidade.
A criminalidade, né? A matança.
Mais a matança.
Moro numa localidade que estava tendo guerra entre facções rivais. Aí eu saí com a minha namorada, eu tinha ido a uma festa. Foi a hora que aconteceu. Eu tomei um tiro, não sei da onde, não vi da onde. As pessoas que pagam, as pessoas mesmo da comunidade que não tem nada a ver, sempre são os que levam sempre a pior. Aí fiquei desse jeito. Tinha 18, 19 anos.
When I was in favelas, what struck me was, first of all, the humanitarian situation. People. It's not difficult to understand how violence and use of drugs is, devastating people. It's terrible. When I was in office in Brazil, of course I was aware of the situation of drugs, but I was convinced that through repression to be possible to stop the production of drugs. But I was wrong at the time.
Yet the suffering experienced in Rio's favelas pales in comparison with the wave of violence unleashed in Mexico, where a battle for control of lucrative trafficking routes over the U.S. border has spiraled out of control.
The Mexican president understood that the situation was very bad because of drug battles, and he decided to confront.
America's Merida Initiative, known to critics as Plan Mexico, has seen President Calderon spend over $1 billion on the Mexican drug war since 2008. More than 50,000 soldiers and federal police are now actively involved in the fight against the cartels. But as in Colombia before it, the violence has exploded as the drug cartels fight against the police, the army, and each other.
It's President Calderon's decision to declare war on the cartels back in 2006 and to use the army against them that I think has generated the violence. I think that the war has created the situation. The situation did not create the war. The problem with this is that the Mexican military is not trained for this. It's not trained for police missions, and this is a police task. And you're asking it to fight a war it cannot win, and it knows it is not winning. And so the military go in and they shoot. That's what soldiers do. All of this has been going on now for 4 or 5 years, and it's getting worse and worse and worse.
Since President Calderon declared his war on drugs in 2006, there have been over 47,000 drug-related murders in Mexico. And the cartels are increasingly targeting elected officials, journalists, and members of the justice system. The government is beginning to lose control of entire regions.
Que este problema no lo vamos a resolver solo los mexicanos, que los mexicanos debemos reclamarle enérgicamente a los Estados Unidos y a los otros grandes países consumidores que tomen una mayor responsabilidad en la solución de este tema.
The United States has always led the war on drugs from the front, both at home and abroad. But 5 decades of an unyielding reliance on police enforcement and the fact that America remains the planet's largest consumer of illegal drugs has had a devastating effect on the land of the free.
Using illegal drugs is against the law. Doing drugs, you risk everything, even your freedom. If you do drugs, you will be caught. And when you're caught, you will be punished. Some think there won't be room for them in jail. We'll make room.
You know, the thing about the United States, we have less than 5% of the world's population, but almost 25% of the world's incarcerated population, roughly about 2.3 million people behind bars tonight. Now, what's the number one thing driving that? It's the war on drugs.
A kilo of pure cocaine costs $1,000 when it leaves a Colombian plantation. By the time it reaches the street in the U.S., it can be worth over $170,000.
The illegality of drugs creates a situation where they're expensive. Now, if you're a wealthy person, then maybe you can afford your own addiction. But the vast majority of street users resort to crime or prostitution or their own drug dealing to support their own addiction.
A heavy user of heroin or cocaine has to spend up to 10 times more per week than a heavy user of alcohol or tobacco.
It's not that cocaine, heroin, marijuana cost any more than alcohol or tobacco to produce. Think about it. If tomorrow people could get heroin or cocaine legally from a store, and tomorrow you could only get alcohol or cigarettes from the black market, then all of a sudden very few people would be committing crimes in order to support their heroin or cocaine habit, and lots of people would be committing crimes to support their alcohol or tobacco habit.
What the war on drugs has done, it's created this massive prison industrial complex in America. In 1970, there were about 330,000 prisoners in the US. Now there are 2.3 million, and we somehow consider that normal. 2.3 million prisoners is more than any other country in the history of the world ever. We have more prisoners than China, and they have 1 billion more people than we do. We have more prisoners than soldiers, but there are more prison guards than there are US Marines. This level of incarceration has just taken on a life of its own.
We know that people can be rehabilitated, but the truth is, most of these people who are minor offenders who get sent to prisons get no rehabilitation.
If you didn't have a drug habit going in, you leave going with a drug habit. There was so much drugs in prison, it was unbelievable. You could get any kind of drug you want in prison. If you can't control drug use in a maximum security prison, how could you control drugs in a free society?
We need look no further than Washington's own doorstep to see the effect that the drug war is having on whole regions of America. In 1950, Baltimore City had over 1 million inhabitants. Today, there are just over half that number. There are 50,000 derelict buildings, and almost 10% of the residents are addicted to an illegal drug.
I can remember the night that my sister was burned. My mother's house caught fire. It was a result of my youngest brother being high for heroin. So she lived for 3 weeks and she died. And that night that we buried her, a friend of the family came past and he told me, he said, try this. And I said, what is that? He said, just try it, it'll make you feel better. It was like this warm feeling just went through my whole body. And it was like, where has this been all my life, you know? And what it was heroin. I think before I realized it was a problem, it was like years had went past. I lost everything. I would go in department stores and I would steal. And I got locked up a couple times. By the time I had got to that point, I was really tired. You know, I wanted a way out, but I didn't know how, you know, or what I was going to do to stop.
There are 600,000 people in this city. In 2007, there were 100,000 arrests. The numbers are staggering when you begin to think about what that means for people. If you have a criminal conviction, generally you are excluded from any support for housing. You are excluded for support for education, and you're not able to get an ever-increasing array of jobs because of your conviction. The reality is that you return to the drug trade. And the drug trade begins to occupy entire communities.
In the neighborhood I policed, men who are born there have about a 12% chance of getting murdered in their lifetime. It seems like these problems are far more important than some sort of futile goal of creating a drug-free society. People should care more about all these deaths, and by and large, the vast majority are related to prohibition.
We could have fighting and killing over cigarettes if we made it a felony to sell a cigarette or to smoke one. So we legalized it. If all you do is try to find a police or military solution to the problem, a lot of people die and it doesn't solve the problem.
But repressive drug policies and their grave consequences stretch far beyond the Americas. Amid the chaos of war, Afghanistan has emerged as the main producer of heroin in the world.
Afghanistan has become like the Walmart of dope. The quantities of drugs that are moving out of Afghanistan regularly are simply colossal. They are unimaginable. They make the quantities that Pablo Escobar moved look like child's play.
A major use of the enormous profits from the production of poppies and therefore heroin goes to the Taliban to finance their illicit operations in subjugating people and in punishing people.
But U.S.-led efforts to cut off Taliban funding by eradicating the poppy crops have in fact driven farmers into the arms of the insurgents.
In this incredibly insecure, lethally uncertain environment, the one crop that they could depend on to bring in enough money to live off, the United States came in to help destroy that.
And of course, once they had lost their source of livelihood, they were then much more open to being persuaded by a Taliban recruitment officer here to take a rifle, take some dollars for the day, and go and shoot at British, American, Afghan soldiers.
It really just contributed massively to getting us to where we are today in Afghanistan, the mess that we have today.
Go, go, go!
Just cut round with it. The thing that sticks in my mind was a direct order to find pictures of burning opium. How can any military task involve taking a picture of burning opium? And I think it is indicative of who was requesting this. This was someone whose prime motivation was counter-narcotics rather than the counterinsurgency campaign or the benefit and well-being of the people of Afghanistan.
Under the Obama administration, the official counter-narcotics policy in Afghanistan has shifted away from eradication. But with the announcement that U.S. and NATO troops will be withdrawn in 2014, calls for widespread eradication of the poppy are growing, and not only from the West.
С коллапсом Советского Союза проблема наркопотребления пошла в гору. На эту тенденцию наложился рост наркопроизводства, взрывной рост наркопроизводства в Афганистане с 2001 года.
Russia wants to take serious action. and has been very vocal in the last year calling for a wide-scale eradication program in Afghanistan. They find it inconceivable that the United States thinks that the biggest threat emanating from Afghanistan is terrorism. They say the biggest threat emanating from Afghanistan is narcotics.
And Russian policymakers of today look backwards to the repressive example set by the United States in the 1990s.
США завершила реализацию так называемого «План Колумбия», в соответствии с которым было у них соглашение между США и Колумбией по вопросам как эрадикации посевов, уничтожения лабораторий и иным мероприятиям, направленным на искоренение наркопроизводства. Мне кажется, это хороший опыт Соединенных Штатов Америки, который нам, России, следовало бы самым активным образом применять на практике.
In 2010, U.S. and Russian forces took part in a joint raid on a drug lab in Afghanistan. And Russia's influence in Afghanistan's war on drugs continues to grow.
As we leave and transition, which will be delicate enough anyway, if in that window of opportunity of transition, those who wish to push the counter-narcotics agenda get their way, and we do see a short, sharp attempt to eradicate poppy, I think that will spell disaster for the country. And a return to the disruptive anarchy that spawned 9/11 and what we came here to rectify.
Get on the ground, now! Now! Now!
Old orthodoxies persist on how to best deal with the supply of narcotics. So how has the war on drugs dealt with the demand?
This is drugs. This is your brain on drugs.
During the time I was in Congress, we tried almost everything we could think of. We got corporations to donate an enormous amount of money to go into public advertising, hard-hitting advertisements that showed kids the terrible things that would happen with drugs.
Toda a propaganda antidroga da minha época era baseada no fato de que a droga destruía o ser humano.
That had a problem because most of the people who were using drugs weren't dead, and they liked to use the drugs, and so it had a credibility problem.
You're gonna die if you mess with dope. Nobody can handle it. Take a look at the nearest junkie and figure it out.
E aí, o jovem questiona todo o discurso que ele ouviu até então.
Hey, kiddies, gather around. The man with the goodies is here. Dig, everybody. LSD.
Então, nesse momento, fica claro que há uma hipocrisia generalizada na campanha antidrogas, normalmente feita por pessoa que nunca experimentou a droga. Então, essas pessoas vêm com esse discurso moralista, conservador, e acham que vão impressionar muita gente. Não vão.
Come on, one drag won't hurt you.
That's not what I heard. I heard it can really mess you up. You heard wrong. Come on, give it a try. It's cool. You don't know what you're doing. Besides, smoking pot's illegal.
Or maybe you're just a little
The
too
moralization of these campaigns produced a polarization between the users and the believers of the campaign messages, who believe that anyone who uses the drug is an addict and a criminal. And politicians have fallen into this trap too.
You point your finger at our generation and you say, well, you had alcohol, you had martinis and so forth, and that was your crutch. Well, maybe so. But then what makes you so much more noble by just deciding to have a different kind of crutch? I'd like to see a generation that didn't have any crutch at all.
Today, a generation after President Reagan left office, the UN estimates there are 230 million drug users in the world. 90% of them are not classified as problematic. And yet the question of how to deal with these people has divided politicians ever since President Nixon first declared his war on drugs.
Nixon's attitude about drugs was very interesting. His instincts were all law enforcement, all punishment, no sympathy, but a very strong commitment to dealing with the problem. Nixon said I could say anything I wanted to say about drugs except one thing. I couldn't support decriminalization of marijuana. He said he was elected president, not me, and if I came out and supported decriminalization, I was history.
60% of the Berkeley voters approved the marijuana ordinance. It specifically told the Berkeley police not to make marijuana arrests without first getting city council approval.
Decriminalization was the permissive pole of drug policy, and it said essentially that there would be no criminal penalty for possession of marijuana. And we had a presidential commission to look at this issue. Nixon appointed the people, and they came out and supported it.
We have made several recommendations to the Congress, to the President, and to the American people. The federal recommendations are as follows. First, possession for personal use is no longer a criminal offense. Second, non-profit distribution of small amounts should no longer be a criminal offense.
So Nixon dissociated himself from the commission report that he'd put together, and he just said, that's not going to happen on my watch.
But Nixon ultimately had bigger issues to worry about than the war on drugs. It was the Watergate scandal, not narcotics, that was his undoing.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
So Nixon is gone and Ford is there. He doesn't have this guidance for me. So I came out and supported decriminalization. And I was a poster drug czar for decriminalization at that point.
With the election of Jimmy Carter in 1977, decriminalization found itself at the forefront of the mainstream political agenda. An end to the war on drugs was in sight.
When I was president, we had the same problem with drug production and distribution and consumption that we presently face. We tried as best we could to minimize the emphasis on criminal punishment. And I made a major statement to the U.S. Congress asking for changes in the law.
And decriminalization spread to 10 U.S. states by 1979. And it looked like the future. It looked like that things were going to go that direction. Then the parents' movement came in, and it stopped, and nobody decriminalized again.
Under the Reagan administration, a hardline policy of zero tolerance reignited the drug war and would entrench political attitudes for years to come.
President Reagan and his wife adopted the drug program as the #1 issue for her to proclaim. She had a phrase, just say no.
Just say no so loud that everyone around you can hear. And if you do that, drugs won't stand a chance.
And she made it clear that her prohibition against drugs included marijuana and everything else. So I don't think there's any doubt that President Reagan made a profound impact then on the consciousness of our country, and I think he also shaped the opinion of many members of our Congress.
The truth is, the vast majority of members of Congress still take a very hard position on drugs. We're against legalizing drugs. We want tougher penalties for drug users, and particularly for people who sell and traffic in the drugs. We want to maintain the long terms, the prison terms and penalties that are there.
In 2009, there were 1.6 million drug-related arrests in the U.S. 1.3 million of these were for possession of drugs alone, and over half were related to marijuana.
I personally fully disagree with the U.S. saying that they are being successful just because they have more people in jail or they have more sentences against traffickers than they had 20 or 10 or 5 years ago. That is not a good way to say that a policy is successful.
This project over the past 22 months has led to the arrest of more than 2,200 individuals.
We've seized their heroin, taken their money.
41 kilograms of cocaine.
$154 million in United States currency.
It's every year the same. They are showing some data, and the data shows more people in prison. We are destroying more plantations of cocaine, so on and so forth.
If they had less violence and less consumption, and well, that would be a success. But what they have now, and the measure of success they have, is wrong.
We have spent hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars on the war on drugs, which has been a complete, total failure.
The problem is that politicians are basically unwilling to spend political capital on this issue, as they know it's unpopular with the public and the media.
What is his position, as you understand it, on drug use? Apparently he has a somewhat libertarian view on that subject, which you, I think, are arguing is not a Kentucky view.
I had a senior law enforcement official tell me that in his judgment, up to a quarter of the White House staff, when they first came in, had used drugs in the last 4 or 5 years.
Accusations about the use of illegal drugs are flying around the Democratic presidential campaign again.
What we have in this issue is similar to what we have in pornography. This is chemical pornography.
The allegation is that while governor, he hosted parties where drugs were used, a violation of state law.
Most politicians, they're afraid of what the political ads will be that their opponents will run in the upcoming election. They're afraid of being accused of being soft on crime or soft on drugs, and that's why oftentimes the politicians lag behind the public. Why? Because the politicians are still stuck.
The party's over. The party's over for drug dealers. We can change the status quo, we can win the war, but we've got to start the war on drugs.
The U.S. just ignores the problem. In this society, it's almost prohibited, banned to talk about the problem.
So you have to break taboo.
In 2011, the Global Commission on Drug Policy set out to correct the mistakes of the past and change the very nature of the war on drugs.
I'm not proposing to replace war by peace. I propose to replace war by a smarter fight. A fight using other instruments, more intelligent instruments to convince people not to use drugs.
So break the taboo and bring in the public debate what experiences in some countries could help to find better solutions.
Portugal has a brave new approach to the drug problem. In 2001, they decriminalized the use of all drugs, meaning that users would no longer face criminal punishment for possession alone.
To see the progress made in Portugal is astonishing, because in Portugal they decided to decriminalize the use of all kinds of drugs, and not just marijuana.
Decriminalized, people do not go to prison, do not go to court even, but there's a penalty that can be applied, and there's a clear sign of disapproval for drug use.
If someone is arrested with drugs in Portugal, they are not taken to court. Instead, they are brought before a dissuasion board made up of psychiatrists and social workers.
The main concern is to understand what are the needs of that people intercepted by police forces using drugs or carrying drugs for personal use, and what do they need? What kind of help can we provide?
The most fundamental step we need to take is to realize that addiction is a medical problem, and therefore addicts need to be treated medically, not criminally. If we accept that basic principle, we overcome most of the disagreements about drug policy.
In Portugal, after decriminalization, the prevalence of drug use among youngsters has declined in the last decade of every illicit drug.
In 1997, drug addiction was officially the #1 political concern in Portugal. Now, after a decade of decriminalization, the issue has fallen as far down as 13th and hardly registers on the political agenda. And even more radical steps have been taken elsewhere. In the 90s, Switzerland faced an AIDS epidemic rapidly spreading through the heroin-using population.
It was clear in Switzerland that repression was not the way, that repression was a part of the problem, that repression was a cause of the dissemination of AIDS, that repression was a cause of the deaths of young people by overdoses.
As president, Global Commissioner Ruth Dreyfus called for a series of dramatic solutions to the epidemic, including medically prescribing clean needles and heroin to addicts who couldn't kick the habit.
How can you speak with people about the problem of drugs if they are addicts, if they are under the threat to be arrested? It's absolutely clear that you have to go to the people, and in order to go to the people, you have to accept in a certain way the people as they are.
In Switzerland, the number of injecting drug users with HIV/AIDS has been reduced by over 50% in 10 years. And the model of putting health before punishment is gathering momentum.
I think there should be safe places where people who have addiction could come and not think they're going to be arrested and will have basic needs met. I have experience with this, including personal experience. I had a brother who was addicted to cocaine. So I know a lot about this. I understand more than most people do what is involved.
Well, dealing with human beings. So we are not just dealing with criminals. The users, very often, they want to escape from the situation. They have no instruments. So why not to give a lift to them?
Who are the addicts? Our children. I mean, people we love. People we would like really to bring back in the normal life.
The American experience with alcohol prohibition provides a wonderful analogy for the problems that we're experiencing today with drug prohibition. By the end of alcohol prohibition, more people were drinking alcohol than at the beginning of alcohol prohibition. And at the same time, you now created Al Capone, and organized crime and violence and corruption, and young people looking up to bootleggers as role models, and shootouts and violence in the streets. You look what's going on in Mexico today, or Central America, or the Caribbean. It's almost like Chicago during the days of Al Capone and Prohibition times 50. So much today of what people identify as part and parcel of the drug problem are in fact the results of our failed prohibitionist policies.
A drug-free world is a fantasy. The war on drugs didn't do away with people's desire for drugs. All it managed to create was a network of criminal supply routes to fulfill the demand.
In 2005, the UN estimated that criminals were trading more than $320 billion a year on the illegal drug market.
The UN estimates that almost 50% of organized crime's profits come from the drug trade. Eliminating this source of revenue would be a devastating blow to criminal cartels.
I am sure that regulation by the state with very clear limitation is the solution.
And then, of course, there are the financial benefits of regulation to consider. The saving on police and incarceration and the profits of taxation.
In 2008, Harvard economist Jeffrey Myron estimated that regulating and taxing drugs would inject over $76 billion a year into the U.S. economy alone.
So imagine if we could turn this thing around across the board, and instead of wasting hundreds of billions of dollars a year, putting those hundreds of billions into the hands of criminals, bringing in the tax revenue instead. What a tremendous savings at a time when so many governments are facing really gross fiscal problems.
A country that has already moved in this direction is Holland, where it is in practice legal to buy and sell small quantities of cannabis in coffee shops. Today, ex-Brazilian President Fernando Cardoso has come to see this for himself.
You are not allowed to advertise cannabis. You're not allowed to sell any hard drugs. You're not allowed to sell cannabis to people under 18 years old. You're allowed to have only 500 grams in stock as a coffee shop, and don't sell more than 5 grams a day to one person. The good thing about the business in soft drugs, in cannabis, in the coffee shop is that it's without any violence.
And what have been the consequences regarding the users?
Well, people might think that it would have led to a sharp increase in cannabis use, because in practice it's free available cannabis. But you will see, if you look at the statistics, that the consumption is quite comparable with surrounding countries.
In spite of Holland's liberal cannabis laws, consumption rates are lower than in surrounding countries like France, Germany, Denmark, and the UK. But would a legally regulated market open itself to big business like alcohol and tobacco did in the past?
New Bel Air, so refreshing. Winston tastes good like it should. Change to Winston, you'll change for good. 'Cause Winston tastes good like a cigarette should.
Look, no one wants their drugs free for all. We need to regulate and control how drugs are produced and sold. No advertising, no selling to minors, labeling dangers. And in fact, tobacco policy today actually shows how effective regulation and good education can be.
We need to regulate drugs the same way we regulate normal cigarettes. In many ways, those are great success stories. We've reduced use by half over a generation or two. If we could do that with heroin and cocaine, that would be a great victory.
The fact of the matter is, when a drug is really dangerous, smart education and smart regulations can reduce use very, very substantially.
E aí você tem que ser honesto na sua abordagem. Seja aberto, seja honesto. Diga isso, realmente a droga é fantástica, você vai gostar, mas cuidado, hein? Porque você não vai poder decidir mais nada, basta isso, basta isso. O grande perigo da droga é que ela mata a coisa mais importante que você vai precisar na vida. É o teu poder de decidir. A única coisa que você tem na sua vida é o seu poder de decisão.
Don't be drug-free because it's illegal. Be drug-free because it's the key to your freedom. It's the key to your future.
After a year of investigation, the Global Commission gathers in New York to present its findings to the world.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the press conference of the Global Commission on Drug Policy.
The fact is that the war on drugs is a failure.
The consumption is not being reduced.
It's cost millions of dollars.
The increasing number of people in jail is there in the statistics.
And it's fueled organized crime worldwide.
Stop the war on drugs, and let's be more constructive in trying to reduce the consumption.
But the strategy of drug prohibition has failed, according to the Global Commission on Drug Policy, an admission by world leaders, including 4 former presidents, a prime minister, and a former UN Secretary General.
Organized crime and cost billions of dollars.
Drug policy has failed.
The most striking thing about the Global Commission is the media reaction to it. My God, it's off the scale. It's everywhere.
The message of the Global Commission came in the right moment and allowed a certain crystallization around this call for breaking the taboo all over the world.
But it is not just the media that reacts. The White House also has something to say.
When the Global Commission came out with its statement, I could have predicted in advance exactly what the drug czar was going to say.
We have spoken about our opposition to legalizing drugs because we know that legalizing drugs is not an answer. We also know...
I think essentially the role of the drug czar in America today is to refrain from any substantive debate about what's wrong with drug policy today. It's to point their fingers at the little signs of progress and ignore all the signs of failure. It's to make sure that this issue doesn't blow up one way or another for the president.
The incarceration approach to drugs.
In 2004, Senator Obama described the war on drugs as an utter failure.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
As president, however, he has not implemented substantial change, with funding for law enforcement still almost twice that allocated for treatment and prevention.
It was not a surprise to see the resistance, because governments have to be more conservative. It's difficult for governments to change. They are afraid because of vote. They don't want to innovate. And the world requires more innovation. And the fact that now ministers and important personalities are joining us is a signal of progress.
There are dozens, if not hundreds, including people in power today who think the same way and don't feel the confidence, the political confidence, the personal confidence to speak out. But when you see this group of such distinction, people who left offices with their reputations intact, people who are oftentimes globally known, standing up and saying enough is enough, that hopefully can embolden others to say the same thing.
In 2011, President Santos of Colombia became the first serving president to break the silence and publicly declare that the world needs to look for new solutions.
Colombia has been fighting drugs and the drug cartels for 40 years. But the business is still going on. And sometimes I feel like in a static bicycle. You work hard, and then you suddenly look to your right, look to your left, and you're almost in the same place. And you see what happens in Mexico and Guatemala. And so I think a new approach, or at least to try to open up, to break the taboo, is what the world should do. There are many alternatives, including the possibility of legalizing drugs. Politically, I know that this has cost, and I have already incurred those costs. They have attacked me for saying what I am saying to you. But I don't think politicians or leaders of any country can only say what people want to hear. In Latin America, there is a growing concern. Before, this was a taboo, and you have to break this taboo. And the taboo has been broken.
Now, for the first time in 4 decades, the countries that have suffered most from this war on drugs are talking back and initiating their own reforms unilaterally.
You have a situation where Latin American leaders of great stature in their countries, great stature in the world, can go to the United States and say, look, this is not working, let's do something else.
Estamos poniendo en la mesa un tema de debate. Ya fue una propuesta del presidente Cardoso, ya una propuesta del presidente Gaviria de Colombia y que ahí ha estado. Y lo que queremos es traerlo nuevamente al debate.
For the first time in history, at the 2012 Summit of the Americas, it was announced that investigating alternative drug policies would become part of the official regional agenda.
The truth is that the war on drugs is a war fought inside the heart and mind of everybody who thinks of using them. But I know that lives can be saved, that they're worth saving, that it's never too late to start. And as long as you have your personal freedom, the ability to think, you have a chance to do better. Don't give that freedom up. That's my message.
I'm not, how can I put, unrealistic. I know that it's difficult to change, but I know also the society does change. It will depend largely on people, on civil society.
We are now at the beginning of a new phase where the public debate will be possible. And I'm sure that will help to change the policy, not only in the US, but also in the world.
It depends heavily on people's pressure for governments to change. Altogether, we are breaking the taboo on drugs.
said I say